Hello everyone, it's time to talk about present problems, but there are many problems, and we are few, so we will highlight the most urgent problem according to our response and creatively explain of The theme presented in the film is that modern human living conditions are characterized by the high dynamics, recurring and increased level of social activity, a high level of adaptation and creating stable emotional state. Admission to the university for each young person is accompanied by a transition to a new education system and new social environment. At the same time, the emotional and physical burden on the student crisis, which being affected by individual and personal characteristics affects all types of his activities as a whole. Special attention of researchers today is directed to the study of self-compassion as one of the conditions for the development of mental states of a person to himself, from the point of view of his role in the adaptation of personality, understood as maintaining the physical well-being of a person and his functionality in different life situations. Mental states are defined as stable characteristics of a personal mental activity for a creation period of times. Also, in order to maintain physical well-being, it is important to understand the severity of a practical mental state of the individual. Therefore, study of mental states and self-compassion is relevant today. The problem of relationships between self-compassion and mental states attracted the attention of origin physicals K. Nave and P. Gilbert. This topic was actively developed in the works of N. Antisferiev, V. Petrovsky, and E. Karlomenkova, E. V. Nikulin, and others, where the authors department the significance of this level of compassion and mental states in human activity. Special attention of researchers today is dedicated to the study of self-compassion as one of the conditions. Mental state is an integral characteristic of mental activity for a creation period of time, showing the peculiarity of the courses of mental process depending on the reflected objects and phenomena of reality, the previous state and mental properties of the mental states, like other phenomena of mental life, have their own case, which is most often the influence of an external environment. In essence, any state is a product of the inclusions of a subject in any kind of activity during which it is formed and actively transformed, while exerting a mutual influence on the subjects of this activity. mental state is a complex and diverse, relatively stable, but changing mental phenomenon that increases or decreases the activity and success of an individual's life in the current specific situation. Based on the above definitions, it is possible to distinguish the properties of mental states. Integrity. This property is manifested in the fact that states express the relationships of all components of the physics and characterizes all mental activity as a whole during a given period. Mobility. Mental states are changeable over time, have a dynamics of development manifested in the change of stage of flow beginning development completion. Relativity stability. The dynamics of mental states is expressed to a much lesser extent than the dynamics of mental process cognitive, volitional, emotional. Polarity. Each state has its own antipode, for example, interest, indifference, cheerfulness, lethargy, frustration, tolerance. The classification of mental states can be based on various criteria. The following classification features are most common. First, according to which mental process behavioral states are divided into gnostic, emotional, and volition. Gnostic mental states usually include curiosity, surprise, amazement, perplexity, doubt, puzzlement, dreaminess, interest. Emotional mental states: joy, chagrin, sadness, indignation, anger, resentment, satisfaction and dissatisfaction, cheerfulness, longing, doom, depression, despair, fear, timidity, horror, attraction, passion, affect. Strong violent mental states: activity, passivity, determination and indication, confidence and uncertainty, restraint and interference, absent-mindedness, calmness. According to the time of the course, short-term, protected, long-term states are designated by the nature of the influence on the personality. Mental states can be cynic states, that activity, vital activity, and asthenic states that suppress vital activity, as well as positive and negative. According to the degree of awareness, the states are more conscious and less conscious, depending on the predominant influence of a person or situation on the occurrence of mental states. Personal and situational states are from the vast expanse of mental states of a person. It is customary to distinguish three large groups: typical positive asthenic states, typical negative asthenic states, and specific states. Typical positive mental states of a person can be divided into states related to everyday life and states related to the leading type of human activity. Typically negative mental states include both states that are polar to typically positive, grief, hatred, indifference, and special forms of states. The latter include stress, frustration, and a state. The third group is specific mental states. This includes sleep-wake states, altered states of consciousness. Summing up, we can say that by their structure, mental states are complex formations that differ in sign, positive, negative, subject orientation, duration, intensity, stability, and simultaneously manifest themselves in the cognitive, emotional, and volitional spheres. The term compassion or its analogies exist in many religious cultures of the past. Harsh living conditions forced people to gather in social groups. As this increased the chance of survival. To maintain a good quality of relationships and to be a valuable social community, people need to be compassionate and empathic, and vice versa. The inability to express compassion leads to social isolation. In Tibetan philosophy, compassion is an essential element of a person's spiritual development and enlightenment. It is like love, gentleness, and cordiality, but it also includes respect for the other and responsibility to him. Thomas Aquinas defined compassion as an inner manifestation of benefactor mercy and also as deep sympathy for someone who is expressing distress and an urge to help this person if possible. Unlike Eastern philosophies, in Christianity, compassion has a thing of Scarface in the name of someone stems from a deep feeling of love, which is originally love for God. In Russian Christian culture, the concept of compassion is as close as possible to mercy, sympathy, and pity. Therefore, it can rather be considered a manifestation of the highest qualities of personality, spiritual and morality of a person, which, without reducing the humanitarian value of this quality, in our opinion, should be supplemented by its considerably as an The original term compassion translates as compassion, following the name of compassion-focused therapy. As an independent direction, modern theories of self-compassion were created by true scientists and practitioners, Neff and Gilbert. According to the theory of Neff, self-compassion means showing kindness to oneself in moments of experiencing pain or failure. The ability to perceive one's experiences as part of the universal human experience and consciously deal with negative feelings. Neff identified three components in self-compassion: kindness to oneself, community with humanity, and awareness. Kindness to oneself means that a person treats himself warmly and supports himself. Communion with humanity is the perception of one's personal experience as a part of the whole human experience. This means that a person views his mistakes and failures not from an agnostic position, but as trials that many people have already passed through over the centuries. This allows you to be more gentle about your failures and weakness. Awareness refers to openness to experiences in the form in which it is the art people, as well as openness to your feelings, the inner pole, without avoiding or destroying them. Since in a period of pain or failure, it is necessary to Awareness does not allow a person to be completely captured by negative experiences. Feelings remain not said, but do not take over the individual. Low awareness, on the contrary, is often characterized by excessive identification with feelings and their unlawful generalization, expressed in the fact that a person generalizes individual experiences and events to the extent of his entire life or personality, which means that he has a chance to consider himself a loser after one mistake, which will affect his experiences of self-worth. Gilbert considers self-compassion as the basis of a sensitive and supportive attitude towards oneself. He explores a self-supporting attitude as opposite to self-criticism. We are really on the concepts mentioned above. However, scientists' work is developed to self-compassion. Compassion for others and others are not considered by us. The importance of the ability to feel compassion for oneself has been shown by many researchers. So, Barnes studying women with chronic pain found that those who treated themselves with compassion and warmth suffered less than those who were self-critical and could not put up with pain. Allen and Merley studying the relationship between self-empathy and coping showed that self-compassionate people are mainly likely to have a positive cognitive resentment. They found that self-compassion positively correlates with self-assessment as an optimistic, wise, proactive, curious, pleasant, expressive, and conscientious person that is in general with the image of oneself as a good and happy person. At the same time, it is negatively associated with the experience of negative emotions and neuroticism. Several studies have been developed to the study of the influence of self-compassion on psychological health. Thus, it was found that patients with paranoid beliefs who are typically not self-compassionate often have low self-esteem, high rates of self-criticism, and Thus, self-compassion has a positive impact on person's experience of his own authenticity as allotedly to himself and his true self, the ability to be himself. Taken together, these studies provide important information about the possible connection of self-compassion with psychological well-being, that is about the adaptive research's role of this phenomenon, which is necessary for the positive functioning of the individual. At the present stage, there is no single concept of self-attitude in psychological science. In that respect, the question of the problem of self-relation was raised by responsives of the psychological school of existentialism, Kierkegaard, Frankl, Jaspers, Camus, despite the fact that philosophers did not consider self-relation as an adaptant category. They raised questions of self-consciousness, well as personal responsibility, thanks to which the meaningfulness of being is achieved, revealing the problem of the attitude of the individual to himself. Throughout the history of psychology, the concept of self-attitude has been used in various interpretations within various psychological schools. I am a concept, global self-esteem. In a number of interpretations, self-relation is presented in the form of an adaptant concept in a number in the form of consultant of another basic concept. For the first time, the term self-relation was introduced by Sugilazza in 1974, who defined the concept as the attitude of the subject of a need to a situation of its satisfaction directed at himself. At the same time, it should be noted that within the framework of psychology, the problem of self-attitude was raised long before the definition of the term. For the first time, the problems of self-attitude within the framework of classical psychology were raised by James, who defined the global self, which includes two components. As an object and a consistent, the self as an object in turn included the following aspects: the material self, the spiritual self, the social and physical self. A consciousness is a process in which an individual acquires experiences, and as an object, the content of this process. In psychology, two directions of studying the phenomenon can be singled out separately. The first direction involves the study of self-attitude in the framework of comparison with the system of human self-esteem. This direction mainly includes the works of Western researchers K. Rogers, J. Marvel, S. Cooper Smith, and L. Wallace, and others. The second direction belongs to the rational psychological science, in which The problem of independence of the status of self-attitude, its structure and content is associated with the development of the theory of the self-consciousness of the individual. The second direction includes science, Starling, Vygotsky, Kohn, Gaich&CO, and others. Ideally, the theoretical understanding of self-attitude proceeded from its interpretation in the form of an effective component of the self-concept, an emotional attitude towards oneself. The principle of the integrity of the I required the introduction of a generalized self-assessment, and dependence on context implied the existence of a system of private self-assessments. It was assumed that the dynamic sum of private self-assessments is combined into a generalized experience associated with the self-image. Stable generalized self-esteem has been the subject of search by Chalvison, McCarthy, The theoretical starting point of such studies was the understanding of the general self-attitude as an effective reaction to a creating content of the self-image. However, it should be noted that while such an approach, the theaters of the structure and functioning of the emotional evolution system remain unclear, making it possible to integrate a system of private self-assessments. There were systems created for integrating and weighing private self-assessments into the global one did not make it possible to obtain correlations between self-esteem and self-attitude. At the same time, the structure of the phenomenon itself practically concatenates with the structure of the self-image, losing the theoretical status of the object of surgical research. Choose when considering self-attitude studies, three different approaches can be designated. We'll tell each about them.
Thank you for giving me the floor. My name is Gaich. 1. Understanding the phenomenon as an effective component of self-consciousness, self-relationship in the structure of self-consciousness. 2. Understanding the phenomenon as a component of self-regulation. 3. Understanding as personality traits. The system analysis of self-attitude includes consideration simultaneously at all three levels of psychological being, activity, 32 personality as a subject of self-consciousness of the semantic core and the subject of this activity. It is obvious that self-attitude serves, on the one hand, as a means of protecting self-identity, on the other hand, it expresses the meaning of I through emotional experiences and a system of assessments.
Compassion is one of the basic moral experience of a person, consisting in participation in the suffering of another being and giving rise to a desire to help him. From such interpretation, it follows that a person sympathizing helps another follows an impulsive desire. So, according to realistic theories, an act has no moral value, since whose actions are recognized as moral which were eventually subordinated to reason and therefore have the opportunity to be analyzed and summed up of creation reasons and grounds, whereas actions committed on the basis of emotional impulses are regarded as committed contrary to a reasonable beginning, as a result of which they are colored in a negative shade. However, living moral experience shows that this is absurd. Indeed, no one of the people would advise another to act not at the behest of the mind, which performs the function of a device issuing commands, and in this connection is the master of the sensuous emotional nature of man. Although according to Vigard, this is not quite true, Speaking of rationality, we only associate it with normativity. If we state that an act is emotional irrational, then it should not be committed. However, can we say that such an emotion as compassion should be rationality, superset only because it is an emotion and the motives are subject to careful analysis and reflection before committing? Rationalist pragmatic morality rejects mental perception following emotional impulses. Even Christian agape which preach love for one's neighbor is still based on a rational and not on an emotional search of action. Compassion in this case appears rather as the highest value, the ideal of behavior. It appears not as an emerging emotion that calls for action, but on the contrary as an that must be rationality formed and cultivated. Despite the positions, we find a similar statement in the arguments of Nietzsche, who speaks not about the cultivation of such an emotion as compassion, but on the contrary about an attempt at internal rational reflection, pragmatic formation of action, and not following the first impulses. The philosopher reproaching Christianity as a cult of pity considers the manifestation of compassion to be not mercenary. The lot of weak people who themselves preach this compassion because the strong do not need it and moreover even interfere. There is formal cult of suffering almost everywhere in Europe. One can find moderate sensitivity and susceptibility to suffering and equally discussion, intermittent in complaints, affirmations, trying to dress up in something higher with the help of religion and various philosophical rubbish. In this sense, with Nietzsche is in solidarity with Scheller, considering compassion like other emotions a manifestation of resentment, because a strong person, in his opinion, is able to rationally and pragmatically assess the situation, and his compassion should have its price. The same is present in the arguments of Weber. In his opinion, the attitude towards sufferers has long been correlated with religious faith. There is a twofold relationship here. On the one hand, those expressing suffering did not participate in various cults and rituals because they could scare away the happens of the people, and on the other hand, some expression of magical assistance associated with the religion's allegement was attributed to them. Therefore, almost all religious experience was reduced to either suffering in the name of the salvation of the soul or rationalizing why a person suffers to establish his sin guilt for something he has done. In addition, the cult of the sufferer appears in the form of the absolute, as a result of which the people seem to be obligated to suffer and sympathy with each other. Let the mystical role of suffering turns to purchasing it onto self. In this regard, describing the evolution of attitudes towards sufferers, we find in Weber confirmation of the hypothesis that suffering as an emotion can be cultivated in connection with socially significant goals. However, if we talk about the evolution of actions, then the motives for committing this action are not taken into account. We find an extreme position among relations who claim that any emotions are irrational effects that should not be cultivated, but generally suppressed. Spinoza notes that compassion in a person who lives according to the guidance of reason is in itself bad and useless. At first glance, this contradicts the very nature of morality, which comes from the belief that human actions committed under the influence of compassion are merciful. However, the experience of someone else's suffering brings the pleasure to any person because it is a contest. As you know, all people try to avoid displeasure and strive for pleasure, because actions committed under the influence of an affective composition state cannot be attributed to moral inadaptation. Spinoza believes that in most cases a person will regret the committed act because he does not have Summing up reason, we can conclude that compassion has socially significant goals which comes into conflict with human desires and aspirations, therefore actions should be subject to strict reflection. To use compassion as an emotion despite the apparent absolute altruism is an alternative format which suggests the emotions are not impulsive and their occurrence is dictated by creation logic. This is also confirmed by the discoveries of modern empirical psychologists about the cognitiveness of emotions, and in all analyzed cases indicates a rational mechanism for the formation of motives of actions, which gives emotional actions the status of At the present stage, there is no single concept of self-relationship. In psychological science, in a respect, the question of the problem of self-relation was raised by representatives of the philosophical school of existentialism. Despite the fact the philosopher did not consider self-attitude as an independent category, they raised questions of self-awareness, values personal responsibility due to which the mindfulness of being is achieved, revealing the problem of the attitude of the individual to himself. Russian religious philosopher of the 20th century Bulgakov Levin Vyshevsky also addressed the issues of self-relation, which characterized the self as an extremely limited, incompressible, isolated from everything capable of going beyond its limits through the activity alternating from its own being. Through the history of philosophy, the concept of self-attitude has been used in various interpretations within the framework of I'm a concept, global self-esteem, self-image, self-esteem. In a number of interpretations, the relation itself is presented as an independent concept, in a number as a component of another basic concept. For the first time, the term self-relation was introduced by Sergei, who defined the concept as the attitude of the subject of a need to a situation of its satisfaction directed at himself. At the same time, it should be noted that within the framework of psychology, the problem of self-attitude was raised long before the definition of the term. For the first time, the problems of self-attitude within the framework of classical psychology were raised by James, who defined the global self, which includes two components, I as an object and I consciousness. The self as an object in turn include the following aspects: the material self, the spiritual self, the social and physical self. I consciousness is a process in which an individual occurs, experiences. At the same time, it should be noted that within the framework of psychology, the problem of self-attitude was raised long before the definition of term. For the first time, the problems of self-attitude within the framework of classical psychology were raised by James, who defined the global self, which includes two components, I as an object and I consciousness. The self as an object in turn included the following aspects: the material self, the spiritual self, the social and physical self. I consciousness is a process in which an individual acquires experience. I as an object, the content of this process. In psychology, two directions of studying the phenomenon can be singled out separately. The first direction involves the study of self-attitude in the framework of comparison with the system of human self-esteem. This direction mainly includes the works of Western researchers Rogers, Marvels, Cooper-Smith, Waves. The second direction belongs to the Russian psychology science, in which the problem of independence of the status of self-attitude, its structure and content is associated with the development of the theory of self-consciousness of the individual. The second direction includes Senshit, Stalin, Vygotsky, Gaich&CO. Intellectually, the theoretical understanding of self-attitude processed from its reception in the form of an effective component of the self-concept. The principle of the integrity of the I required the introduction of a generalized self-assessment and dependence on the context implied the extent of a system of private self-assessments. It was assumed that the dynamic sum of private self-assessments is combined into a generalized experience associated with the self-image, stable generalized self-esteem. The theoretical starting point of such studies was the understanding of the general self-attitude as an effective reaction or to a creating content of self-image. However, it should be noted that with such an approach, the features of the structure and function of this emotional evolution system remain unclear, making it possible to integrate a system of private self-assessments. The very system created for integrating and weighing private self-assessments into the global one did not make it possible to obtain correlations between self-esteem and self-attitude. At the same time, the structure of the phenomenon itself practically coincides with the structure of the self-image, losing the theoretical status of the object of psychological research. Choose when considering self-attitude studies 3 different approaches.
1. Understanding the phenomenon as an effective component of self-consciousness, self-relation in the structure of self-consciousness. 2. Understanding the phenomenon as a component of self-regulation. 3. Understanding as personality traits.
The system analysis of self-attitude includes consideration simultaneously at all 3 levels of psychological being: activity 52 personality as an object of self-consciousness of the semantic core and the subject of this activity. It is obvious that self-attitude serves on the one hand as a means of protecting self-identity. On the other hand, it expresses the meaning of I-truth, emotional expressing, and a system of assessments. Modern social culture conditions of human life are characterized by high dynamics of change. In this case, a person needs an increased level of social activity, a high level of adaptation, and encouraging stable emotional state. The emotional and psychological load of the individual increases, which, being reflected by individual and personal characteristics, affects all his activities and interaction with society. The fear of self-compassion and the compassion of the others is accompanied by a lack or low level of kindness to oneself. An experience of community with humanity awareness, however, is positively associated with self-criticism, self-identity, and excessive identification. All these connections indicate the beneficial role of compassion, whatever it comes from the subject himself or other people. To improve the ability to feel compassion for oneself, students should develop a level of understanding of their emotions and their management, develop the ability to rationally distribute their own activity in different aspects of life. Also, support of students during the educational process in order to form and develop compassion for oneself.